بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا إنك أنت الجواد الكريم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. In the last 20 or so episodes, we've looked at Islamic legal maxims, and we have highlighted in just about every discussion of each maxim how those maxims are relevant in the current times in which we live, particularly with reference to Islamic finance. We've finished dealing with the maxims per se, but in the remaining series of episodes of this topic, I'd like to look at issues related to Islamic finance in particular. So today's show will be the maqasid of the Shariah with regard to wealth. Now, maqasid of Shariah is translated as the objectives of the Shariah. Maqsad comes from the word qasada, to intend or to head for something with an aim or a goal. So maqsad is what is intended. Maqasid of Shariah is the objectives of the Shariah, the objectives of the lawgiver from his legislation. Shariah, of course, as most Muslims know, linguistically it comes from a word meaning a watering place. So if you're in the desert, finding a water hole is crucial to survival. So the term Shariah linguistically refers to that water source, and it also refers to a path that leads to that water source. So this is like that original meaning has been transferred to the rules that are embodied in the Quran and the Sunnah because of this relation between that physical necessity of water for life and the human necessity also for the guidance of Allah in how we live our lives. So the water to which we are being led is the benefit, how to live an honorable and decent life in this world, and also that eternal life in the hereafter. And so the road that leads us to that is Allah's instructions about how to live in this world, what to do, what not to do. His laws are not abath. You know, if you look at Surah Al-An'am, one of the themes that's mentioned near the end of that surah, there's this discussion that reflects a debate that was going on between the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims on the one side and the pagans of Mecca. And they had all these kind of strange rules related to animals you can eat and that you can't eat. So they said, well, there's certain animals that only men can eat, and they're off limits to women and children. They said that if there's a fetus and it's born dead, then both men and women can eat it. So Allah, in mentioning this statement about their position, He said, سَيَجْزِيهِمْ وَصْفَهُمْ إِنَّهُ حَكِيمٌ عَلِيمٌ, because they were attributing these rules somehow that these are divinely inspired rules, that they got, that these rules are not rules that they made up out of their own heads, but that they got it from the Lord of the universe. And so He's saying He will pay them recompense for their description. Description of who? The implied description of Allah. And then He goes on to affirm the attributes of knowledge and wisdom. Innahu alimun hakim. So these arbitrary rules that have absolutely no reason behind them, they are not befitting Allah. I mean, this goes to this major dispute between schools of Aqidah in explaining the acts of Allah. And the Mu'tazila were famous for their position that Allah is obliged to do certain things. And of course, the reaction to that would be, nobody obliges Allah. Who are you to say that Allah has to do this or that? And in modern times, there was a a reprise of this same kind of debate. You know, there's this famous debate that went on between Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr. They were two of the greatest scientists of the 20th century. And Einstein, of course, he came up with the theory of relativity. And Niels Bohr was one of the pioneers who really led the way for quantum theory, which is describing what goes on in atoms at the subatomic level. And the picture of the world that developed out of the experiments that led to the formulation of quantum mechanics was something where you can't exactly pinpoint things. You can't know the position and the velocity of these subatomic particles at any given time. And it's a very statistical kind of matter. And Einstein, he would keep objecting to these features of quantum mechanics by saying, God doesn't play dice with the universe. And finally, after hearing this for the umpteenth time, Niels Bohr told him, stop telling God what to do. So in the classical Islamic debate, there were opposing schools of Aqidah who told the Mu'tazilites, stop telling God what he has to do. The Mu'tazili answer was that we're not telling God what to do, but given that he has these attributes of being wise and kind, then it is his nature that he would do this or that. And the famous position of the Ash'ari school, which is a rather strange position, is that you can't interpret any of Allah's commands in terms of achieving benefit or harm for human beings. And that was a position that was rejected by the other major school of scholastic theology, which was the Maturidis. The Maturidis disagreed with the Ash'aris on this point, and they said that Allah's rules can be explained when it comes especially to things related to mu'amalat in terms of benefit can be deduced. You know, what exactly is the wisdom behind this and that ruling? And Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, they basically agreed with the Maturidis, and the distinction between all of those who agreed seemingly with the Mu'tazilis on this issue, but are considered from Ahl Sunnah, was that they said that Allah, he does these things tafaddulan, that it is from his overwhelming grace that he makes those kind of rules, that he's not obliged to do them. As we already mentioned, the Mu'tazilis have the angle by which they would respond to that. At any rate, the whole issue of is there wisdom behind the laws of the Shariah, if we look at this issue in the contemporary debate, for people associated with Islam and promoting Islam in a society, to take the position that these are arbitrary rules, it's basically tying your hands behind your back in the context of the contemporary debate, because the argument of secularists and anti-Islamic forces is that these rules are arbitrary and outdated. And if somebody says, well, that's just the way it is, obey it whether it destroys you or not, don't worry about whether it's good for you or bad for you, it takes away one whole strategy by which the pro-Islamic forces in these kinds of debates can present their case. So the position that the rules of the Sharia have wisdom behind them is a well-founded position. And Ash'ari scholars actually tended to actually find themselves in a kind of a dilemma, because from an Aqidah point of view, they were committed to this denial of hikmah in Allah's laws, but from a fiqh point of view, they were committed to qiyas. Well, we'll come to a point where I have to take a break. We'll be back in a minute. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So we're talking about the kind of a bind that the Ash'ari scholars got into, because When it came to Aqidah, they said, no, there's no explaining Allah's laws in terms of wisdom and maslahah, benefit for mankind. So in that area, they were denying that whole concept of the rational basis for the rules of the Shariah. But these scholars also were fuqaha, and when it came to fiqh, they accepted qiyas as a legitimate form of legal argument. Well, what is qiyas? Qiyas is identifying the ruling for a case about which there is a Sharia text, and then determining, well, what's the reason for that law? What is the sabab? What is the illah? What's the ratio legis? I don't know how you pronounce it exactly because it's a Latin term. But in Arabic, the illah, what's the illah of that hukum? What's the reason for the effective cause of that law? If you identify that and you have a new case that is not covered by that specific text, but they share the same effective cause, then the ruling from the first case can be applied to the new case. Now, qiyas is a valid form of legal reasoning, and one of the masalik al-illah, one of the ways by which the illah is identified is that there's munasaba. There's some rational relationship between the rule and the effective cause. And that rational basis goes back to maslahah. And Imam al-Ghazali, he mentioned what it is that the Sharia considers to be maslahah, which is the preservation of life, the preservation of religion, preservation of the intellect, preservation of progeny, and the preservation of wealth. Now, if we look at what are the ways by which the objectives of the Sharia can be known, the sources of the Sharia are the Quran and the Sunnah. So the methodology by which the science of maqasid al-Sharia was built and arrived at, the methodology on which it is based is what's called inductive reading of the text. So people who are fiqh scholars, their concern tended to be juz'i. Okay, here we have a case, particular case, what's the rule for it? Okay, let's look for the evidence. Okay, there's a piece of evidence here that relates, this from the Quran, this from the Sunnah. We put together 5 or 6 pieces of evidence and we arrive at a ruling for this case. So it's sort of like using a microscope. You're focused in on a detailed case, detailed issue. The methodology for maqasid al-Sharia is a survey methodology, which is, okay, there's a rule here and that's the effective cause. There's a rule here, that's the effective cause. And you start to see the same effective cause for this rule is present in this rule. And taking this survey, you start to build up a recognition of patterns in the Sharia. Now, if we compare that with qawaid fiqhiyya, there's a similarity in the methodology there. Qawaid fiqhiyya is a survey of the rulings of jurists on many, many topics. That's how the maxims were extracted from these surveys of ruling. Maqasid al-Sharia doesn't look so much at the rulings, it looks much more at the evidence, and it pulls out the illah from numerous texts and correlates them. Now, one of the features of Sharia texts is that sometimes the illah is mansusa, which means that Allah identifies the reason for the ruling. And sometimes He doesn't. Like, for instance, with the riba, the reason for the prohibition is not explicitly stated. But with regard to the distribution of fay, a form of ghanima, it mentions various categories. The verse in Surah Hashr mentions various categories who are recipients for this form of wealth, and then it mentions the reason behind it. كَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْكُمْ, in order that that wealth should not just become something that's circulated among the rich amongst you. So that's an example of illah mansusa, or hikmah mansusa, the wisdom behind that ruling. So what happens if there's a ruling or there's a text with a law and the illah, the effective cause, is not explicitly stated in the text? Well, then that requires exertion of legal reasoning in order to extract or arrive at a reasoned deduction about what the illah would be in that case. Now, scholars who say that everything in fiqh should be qat'i, 100% certainty, like Ibn Hazm, the Zahiri scholar, scholars who take that point of view, they reject this whole process. They say there's too much human intellect involved in this process. It's too speculative, and therefore all of it is saying about a law what you don't know. That's a minority opinion because, as Imam al-Shafi'i repeatedly made the point, one of the points of his book Al-Risala is that fiqh issues in most cases are dhanni. There is an element of uncertainty to them. They're not 100% certain. They're based on preponderant evidence, not what's called qat'i or perspicuous evidence. Now, what happens when you use maqasid al-sharia along with usul al-fiqh and the detailed evidence is that you get, maqasid gives you a framework by which to understand the place of particular detailed rulings in the overall picture of the sharia and the objectives of the lawmaker. And so if you don't use maqasid al-sharia in ijtihad, then you end up having these ultra-literalist rulings, and if you abandon the detailed evidence and the rules of usul al-fiqh and you say, okay, we're just going to use maqasid al-sharia to make ijtihad, which is one of the hallmarks, actually, of some of the contemporary people who give opinions on fiqh issues, usually from some kind of non-sharia educational background, that those people end up sort of trampling over things which are settled issues, and they take great liberties with the sharia, which could involve disregarding sharia texts or just overriding them based on terms like maslaha and darura without those terms being defined properly and the parameters for them being put in place and being mobilized when discussing detailed evidence, or twisting the meaning of sharia text to meanings that the wording cannot carry except with a concerted effort to ignore the obvious meanings. If we look at some of the divisions of the goals of the sharia or the purposes of the sharia, Ibn Ashuri mentions 4 ways to categorize them. One is the objectives of the lawgiver, and there's also the objectives of the mukallaf, the subject of the law. So the sharia doesn't deny that the mukallaf has valid objectives, but the lawgiver has objectives and the mukallaf has objectives, and if there's some case of conflict between the two, then the objectives of the lawgiver have precedence over those of the objectives of the subject of the law. And then there are some objectives of the sharia which are primary, and there are others which are secondary. Tab'iyya, we mentioned in one of our earlier episodes, at-tabi'u tabi'un. So one of the meanings of tabi' is secondary. And so if there's some kind of a conflict between primary and secondary objectives, then the primary objectives would take precedence. There are certain objectives which are amma. They're present throughout. They're objectives that run through the whole sharia. And then there are certain objectives which are particular to a particular aspect of the sharia. So again, those overall comprehensive purposes would have greater precedence, inshallah. And then there are certain maqasid which, for sure, we know that's a maqsad of the sharia. And there are some which are dhanni. they're speculative. The way at which they were arrived at is based on a preponderance of supposition, but they're not 100% sure. So in that situation, that which you're sure about would always take precedence over that which you are unsure of. So that's an overview of the maqasid of the Sharia as a whole, which we need to understand before we get into looking at the objectives of the Sharia with regard to wealth itself. Now, we won't have time to get into much of this because we're near the end of this episode. We'll get into it in much further depth in the next episode, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allahu a'lam.